Thank you so much. Hello, everyone. I'm very happy to be here today, and I wanted to thank all of the organizers of the Camden Conference for having me, especially Kimberly Scott, who was very patient with all of my problems. And I wanted to thank the audience for welcoming me to the great state of Maine, even in February. And I'm really very, very honored to be on stage with these amazing speakers. These are the people I call for quotes so that I sound smarter, so it's really an honor to be here. So I'm going to talk about why Recep Tayyip Erdogan, the president of Turkey, has been in power, remained in power for over 20 years. Can you hear me okay? Yes. Okay. And perhaps in another way, talk about what happened to Turkey. How did it go from this aspiring democracy to this strange new autocracy? As one academic has put it, Erdogan has created a mind-blowing social, political, economic, and systemic transformation. But how did a poor kid from the back streets of Istanbul pull off such a feat? The existing explanations are often unsatisfying, at least to me. In the years after Trump and Brexit, Western pundits and politicians divided the world between democratic and authoritarian countries. Erdogan found himself lumped amongst the strong men: Trump, Modi, Putin, Duterte, and Orban. The list never made sense to me. All of these countries are so different, their histories so unique. Westerners, it seemed, wanted to believe that these men were systemic aberrations, disruptions to some preordained timeline of democratic progress. But I knew Erdogan was the sum of myriad Turkish influences and traditions, so many of which are authoritarian, populist, and imperialist. I also knew that Erdogan's popularity had been the product of genuine political and social achievements, real improvements for his people. Even if Erdogan had always dreamed of creating a new country, which he has, his own country, the old one must have been broken enough to suggest that he could. The question to me seemed less why democracy was failing, and more why 20th century nation states weren't surviving the 21st. A little bit first about how I got there. In 2006, when I was 29 years old, I won a fellowship from an organization called the Institute of Current World Affairs to live in Turkey for 2 years and write about it. And to the graduates, please come talk to me about this fellowship. It's amazing. Although I went when I was 29 because I'm a late bloomer. Okay, I moved to Istanbul in 2007 when then Prime Minister Erdogan was beginning his second term. Now, there was a period of widespread optimism about Erdogan, who spoke the language of human rights and liberalism. This was not long after September 11th, and some Western journalists, like me, accepted him as a kind of solution in the clash of civilizations. Concerns about his Islamist roots, especially during the War on Terror, were offset by the party's economic vision, its pro-business vision, which looked reassuringly Western and capitalist. In fact, the Turkish economy seemed to flourish, even when the 2008 global financial crisis happened, and the country, which was once so poor, began to look shinier, especially Istanbul. It honestly felt like a big party in Istanbul in those years. But the city was Erdogan's town. He grew up there, and his family was formed by the humiliation of the migrant experience, the flight from the countryside. Now, Erdogan grew up in Kasımpaşa, which is a neighborhood on the European side in the European quarter, but down on the Golden Horn. I know some of you have been there. And it was a poor and scrappy neighborhood, and a lot of migrants moved there. And he grew up fighting in the streets and playing soccer. And when he would get in trouble, his father, this is the story goes, would hang him from his arms. And so that might give you some insight into his psychology. It does seem like authoritarians have mean fathers a lot of the time. And also, I went to Kasımpaşa once, and I met this guy, and he claimed he was Erdogan's best friend, which is like a lot of guys claim they're Erdogan's best friend. But he said, how you know he's Kasımpaşa is to watch his walk, watch that walk. That's Kasım Pasha, which was like sort of like walking with your shoulder thrust forward. So that's the kind of reputation of the place. But the conservatives of Turkey who crowded in these urban backwaters looked for new ways of understanding how to be Muslim and prosper in the modern world. It is important to remember that the Turks had lost its great Ottoman Empire in the beginning of the 20th century. And even if they were always part of NATO and included in the American sphere of influence, they also felt ostracized and even stigmatized by the West. The same thing goes for Turkey's religious or poorer, more conservative communities. They felt rejected by Turkey's secularist, Western-looking identity. They felt excluded from its economic system, which they were. Both Turkey and its Islamists sought autonomy, independence, and dignity. And so throughout the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, religious people and religious parties fought for a place in the country and a place in the world. In Turkey, in the beginning, the Islamists did so by working really, really hard. This was in part how Erdogan became Istanbul's popular mayor in the 1990s. He improved its roads, he improved transportation, its utilities, he picked up the trash. I mean, literally, picked up the trash. When Erdogan became prime minister in 2003, it was a victory of the most democratic kind. He was opposed by the military, the judiciary, and the country's elites. If you remember, they did put him in jail at one point. But he won by addressing poor people's concerns, by speaking their language. You can call this populist, but the oppression or discrimination he was highlighting was real. It wasn't artificial. The first 7 years of Erdogan's rule were so successful. The economy was booming. He was fixing the healthcare system. He was trying to make peace with the PKK, the Kurdish militant movement, with whom Turkey had long fought a civil war, that Western pundits touted Turkey as a model for the Middle East. In the background, somewhat out of view, Erdogan was committing injustices to ensure his own future survival. First, he was building his own business class, one loyal to him. He managed this by primarily by using his parliamentary majority, the party's parliamentary majority, to change laws around bid procurement, urban renewal, and privatization. Erdogan was able to initiate these huge mega projects, tunnels, airports, mosques, bridges, which his cronies would make huge amounts of money from, which would eventually go back to the party, which would eventually be doled out as charity to the poor. And so this created a really loyal voting class. And it also, these mega projects instilled a lot of pride in people because it just reinforced this idea of, wow, Turkey is becoming this big, powerful, modern country. Second, he got rid of his staunchest opponents. His government initiated sham legal trials against secularists, accusing them of plotting to overthrow his democratically elected government. But this was for some people persuasive because Turkey's military had staged 4 military coups in the past, each time deposing elected leaders, shutting down political parties, and calling for new elections. So some people did not see what Erdogan was doing as revenge, which it was. Its bid for accession to the European Union had forced Turkey to make serious democratic reforms. But if you remember, around 2010, Europe wasn't much excited about the Turks joining Europe. They were discouraging, to say the least. Erdogan began to take a hard look at Europe. Their countries, at the Europeans, their countries were a mess after the financial crisis. So he started to look east to new markets, the Arab world, Africa, and Russia. Then came the Arab Spring. The violence of the Arab Spring, the legacy of the war on terror, had spread to Europe and Turkey in new ways. Jihadis were flying into Istanbul airport and then transferring to domestic flights to cities in the south and to Syria. Millions of Syrian refugees sought safety in Turkey, which would eventually enrage some Turks, especially after their own economy began to falter. In the process, Erdogan began transforming one of the pillars of 20th century Turkey, its national identity. I spent a decade reporting from one neighborhood in Istanbul where a lot of Syrians had moved. And what I noticed was it kind of split the community. Some Turks who were more secularist, Western-looking, they were very upset about the Arabs arriving. They believed they had sort of left behind the Arab Middle East. This is something that they learn in school books as well. They thought that they were kind of above the Arabs, and so they did not like this reminder, and they did not like them in their country. Some of the religious Turks, however, were a little more open, as it was sort of part of this idea of a greater Islamic ummah. And also they listened to Erdogan, and he told them to help their Syrian brothers. But when the old national identity starts to be seriously challenged, a lot of other things start to fall apart too. Perhaps even the national ideology, and also the institutions held up by it. At this time, the Islamic State, or ISIS, was taking over large swaths of the region. Bombs started going off, first outside Istanbul, and then inside Istanbul itself. The chaos of the region caused Erdogan to fear a rebellion within his own borders, so he helped start a war in Turkey's southeast, in the Kurdish region, as well as involve himself militarily in Syria. And you will see Syria will come up again and again and again. Why did he do that? There is no foreign policy issue more important to the Turks than the Kurdish issue. With Syria at war, an offshoot of the PKK, the Kurdish militant and sometimes separatist group, had begun building a state in northern Syria called Rojava. This was a total no-go for Turkey. War abroad, as we sort of know, is often an excuse for oppression at home. In Turkey, new forms of repression followed around the time that he entered, got more involved in Syria, and was fighting with the PKK. The repression was against opposition politicians. It was definitely against journalists. It was against protesters. And I have to say that at this time, I began to feel that in the Middle East, borders were dissolving, nation states were failing, and the reversal of democratic progress in the world had begun. That's how it felt. And I'd return to New York sometimes, really surprised that everyone was continuing on as normal. But of course, this would change for everyone in 2016. I just think we had this feeling before that. So 3 events around this time also really scared the daylights out of Erdogan, and I believe served as major turning points in the country's fate. And so, this is not to excuse him in any way, but there were these threats. And one was the 2013 Gezi Park protests, you might remember, which was over construction and over development and the destruction of the environment. They were huge, they lasted for a month, and they really freaked him out. The second thing that scared him was the overthrow of the Muslim Brotherhood leader Mohamed Morsi in Egypt by the Egyptian military. The Turks thought the Americans were behind it because the Americans had sometimes been behind coups, and they feared they were next. And the third threat was an intra-government squabble between 2 groups within the government, the Erdogan faction and a group called the Gülenes. They had begun fighting, openly fighting, attacking one another, and Erdogan felt genuinely threatened by them. They were very powerful. It's not to excuse Erdogan, as I said, but it is sort of to say that we have to keep in mind and really look at the major events happening in the world when a lot of these regimes were changing. I think it's very important. And to show that this global environment in the age of globalization, mass migration, technology, transnational war, has huge effects on domestic politics. What was also happening in Syria? Turkey and Russia were working together. Putin and Erdogan were working together. Sometimes they were on the same side, sometimes they were not, but they maintained their relationship, which of course affected Turkey's relationship with the US. The other big thing that was happening was that Europe was giving Turkey billions of dollars to keep the Syrian refugees in Turkey and out of Europe, because right-wing nationalism was spiking. What that meant was that Europe wasn't exactly worrying about Erdogan's human rights abuses. He used the Syrian refugees as pawns, but it also won him a place at the big table with the great powers. So Erdogan and Turkey, smack in the middle of everything, seemed to be making themselves indispensable. That gave him a lot of leeway at home. In the years 2015 and 16 and 17, especially after the 2016 military coup, which failed to take Erdogan down, but emboldened him to give himself these emergency bigger powers, basically, Erdogan began systematically assaulting state institutions and the organs of Turkey's democracy. So that's the press, the civil society, the state bureaucracy. He fired thousands of people. The parliament, the judiciary, the universities, the unions, and the entire Kurdish minority movement. He essentially neutralized the 40% of people who did not vote for him. And the human cost was enormous. Thousands of people went to jail or were exiled or have been killed. This went on for the next decade, and it continues today. During the years starting 2018 through the pandemic into the 2020s, even as the country fell into what is truly a terrible financial crisis. I don't know if that's clear to people outside, but people are really suffering. And it also continued after Turkey suffered an enormous earthquake in 2023, in which 50,000 people died, although I don't think we really know the true number. Erdogan remained. He won more elections, narrowly, but he won them. The last time Erdogan was elected president, yet again, was in 2023. Again, it was after that massive earthquake, for which he was blamed for the shoddy construction of the buildings. And he was also blamed for the failed emergency response. And everybody thought he was going to lose this election, actually. But I think in some ways, what happened is that when Turks had to sort of contemplate who was going, I mean, the elections are not totally fair and free at this point, but I think that what happened was that Turkey's geography, in a way, had proved too big to fail. Erdogan had continued to make himself important to the US, Europe, and Russia, and despite increasing unhappiness about his management of things at home, his achievements still made him seem presidential on the global stage. This had been Erdogan's getaway car, the unprecedented power Turkey, under his tutelage, appeared to attain on the world stage. He had turned the pride that was in clean streets and the pride that was in mega projects into pride in drones and military expansion. By then, not only in Syria, but in Libya, Ukraine, Azerbaijan, and beyond. When Bashar al-Assad's regime in Syria fell in 2024, Erdogan seemed to emerge a victor. The idea that Turkey had become more authoritarian during his reign was somewhat of the flaw in the conventional narrative. Autocracy always ran through Turkey's politics and state structure. What its example highlights is that countries ostensibly democratic often have deeper autocratic or repressive underpinnings than they like to acknowledge. After the years of military intervention, Erdogan, in his early years, adopted the language of free markets, liberalism, and human rights, and stretched those politics of optimism into the Obama years. But the war on terror persisted and mutated into its ultimate nightmare in Syria, which unleashed that darkness in the form of terrorist states and a refugee crisis that spread anti-Muslim and anti-migrant hatred to Europe, the United States, and beyond. The surge of authoritarianism followed almost naturally. Modi, Putin, Duterte, and Erdogan, all these men were strengthened during this period of ferment, as well as from the examples, I would say, of the Bush, Obama, and Trump administrations, all of whom offered the world during the war on terror their own versions of imperial presidencies. Who could imagine another leader then standing up for the Turks in this strange, new, dangerous world? Erdogan had turned Turkey's political trajectory into a civilizational project, an assertion of Turkey's spiritual and geopolitical significance. When I asked one of my favorite Turkish thinkers, Solih Özel, why Erdogan's people still supported him, he said, because if they renounce Erdogan, it would be like renouncing their own souls. One last thing, because I think you might be curious about this, because obviously half the country does not like Erdogan. So what happened to the opposition during these 2 long decades? How had they failed to protest or stop Erdogan? What did they regret? When I asked this question to all kinds of people, women in the corporate world, leftist Kurdish academics, low-level bureaucrats, liberal journalists, they all said they regretted the same thing. I was totally shocked. It wasn't that they wished they protested Erdogan more. Their answer wasn't about him at all. They regretted that in the first years he came to power, that they had not, as individuals, worked to overthrow the leadership of their main opposition party, the CHP, i.e. the equivalent of, say, our Democratic Party. And if you think I'm making a pointed analogy here, I am. For a time under Erdogan, Turks still had functional elections. The opposition could have beaten him, but they failed to recognize something early, that when the charismatic populist authoritarian comes to power, only an entirely new politics or mode of political figure can defeat him, that the world, in effect, has been remade by his arrival. And they have to invent a new politics, a new face for their own party. The Turkish opposition almost found that new political figure. His name is Ekrem İmamoğlu, the mayor of Istanbul, and in 2025, Erdogan put him in jail, where he remains. The opposition was a decade late. But I won't say too late, because if living in Turkey has taught me anything, it is that no one should count that country out. Thank you.